Precava, as you know, is this large vein here draining the blood from the anterior portion of the body, from the forelimbs, the neck, the head, and the thorax into the heart, specifically the right atrium. Right, so this is the precaval vein, and naturally it would receive blood from all those regions that I mentioned through smaller veins or tributaries, just like a river. And one of the first tributaries of the precaval vein is this vein here going to the chest or the sternum, and that's the internal mammary vein, sometimes called as the internal thoracic vein. Get used to their plastic and transparent appearance. This is the internal mammary vein going to the sternum and draining the ventral thoracic region, and it actually extends all the way to the abdominal region and becomes the superior epigastric veins. So this is an extension of that internal thoracic vein, but here in the abdominal region it's named the superior epigastric vein. So that's one of the first tributaries of the precava. Another one is this huge vein here at the back side. That's the Azygos vein. The Azygos vein drains the blood from the intercostal muscles via intercostal veins. I hope you can see it. This is one intercostal vein. So yeah, this one containing coagulated blood is the Azygos, and it goes all the way down to the dorsal thoracic wall and gives rise to these tiny intercostal veins. Intercostal veins. Right? And then eventually you'll see that the precava is actually made, or a fusion of two veins, the brachiocephalic veins. So the left and the right brachiocephalic veins fuse and drain into the precava. So here's the left. Let's follow the left brachiocephalic vein. And then you'll see that it will also soon split into the external jugular vein and the left subclavian vein. But before it does that, it also receives a tributary from all the way to the brain via the vertebral vein. So that's the vertebral vein draining the brain of blood and passing it to the brachiocephalic. So it's three-dimensional, so you have to make use of your imagination. So that's the vertebral vein going dorsally. It passes through the vertebro-arterial canal along the cervical vertebral column. And then let's follow the left subclavian. This is the left subclavian vein. And then once it passes over the thoracic wall, in the axillary region, it's now called the axillary vein. So it just changes name. And the axillary vein will drain the blood from the forelimb, obviously, and it receives blood from various parts of the forelimb via its tributaries, one of which is this flimsy vein here, easily cut during dissections. Is the ventral thoracic vein. Ventral thoracic vein going straight up to the pectoralis muscles, and this larger tributary is the subscapular vein, and then the axillary vein just goes more distally and gives rise to the thoracodorsal vein draining the latissimus dorsi. Thoracodorsal vein. And then here in the upper arm region, the axillary vein will now be called the brachial vein. So it's now called the brachial vein here. Alright, so let's follow the tributaries of the external jugular. The external jugular immediately has a tributary. This is the internal jugular vein. Internal jugular vein. And the much larger one is the external jugular vein. And then it receives blood from the shoulders via the transverse scapular vein. So transverse scapular. So it's different from the subscapular vein of the axilla. This one is the transverse scapular. The transverse scapular vein will actually anastomose, meaning it will form a connection with this vein on the lateral surface of the brachium. That's the cephalic vein. So the cephalic vein is connected to the transverse scapular vein, and it will drain into the external jugular vein. So let's follow the external jugular vein anterior. Eventually at the near the angle of the jaw. Let's look at the right side. It's clearer here. So you can see near the angle of the jaw, it will split. The external jugular will split into an anterior facial vein and a posterior facial vein. And then the posterior facial vein will split into an anterior auricular vein and a posterior auricular vein, passing on the anterior and posterior sides of the ears, respectively. Okay, and in some specimens, this may be still intact. So this is the transverse jugular vein connecting the two jugulars on either side. Transverse jugular vein. And yeah, those are the tributaries of the Precaval that we can see from our cat specimen. Next, we examine the postcaval vein and its tributaries draining the rest of the posterior part of the body.